Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here. We're starting the next chapter, chapter 2, of The Little Lame Prince and His Traveling Cloak. Now, children, if you remember, yesterday he was christened, and the lady-in-waiting, who was very vain, was more concerned about how her robe, her dress looked than holding the baby, and she wasn't used to holding the baby, and he was dropped. Because of that, he had an injury. And while he was being christened, his mother died. His mother had been very sickly. She was older when she had him. And at the end, I'll tell you a personal story, which is very close. So, in the meantime, I just want you to think again, as I said at the end of last time, is there anyone in your neighborhood who has a disability, someone who's shut in? Please reach out to them and have your parents help you do that. Maybe you could make a card or do a craft. This, as I showed you yesterday, is a walking stick, but for a child it would be like a cane, like in Dickens, in Scrooge, and Tiny Tim had to have a cane under his armpit to walk. This is kind of like that. This one is made out of spools and it has real thread. Green, yellow, orange, green, red, and blue. So it's a very cool stick. But this is a bit like what a child, when he got a little bit older, would wear, and he'd support himself under his, if he could. But in this case, he was lame in both legs, so he couldn't do that. Now, this is a classic story. It was written in 1877, and there are a lot of things in it that may not make sense for you children who live now with computers and iPhones. I'm going to go get something at the beginning, and then I'm going to show you some clothes and christening dress, and in the next few days I'll show you more. There was a grand procession, as you remember. There was a grand procession. Thank you, Punky. You didn't have to move because I have to sit down. I can't. Hey, don't bite me. Ah! Punky, out. There was a grand... Punky, it's all right. There was a grand procession. She likes the Easter lilies behind me and wants to get them, but she can't. There was a grand procession, and it talks about a man with a golden stick, and I wanted to explain to you, everyone, what that was. This is a walking stick. It would be Edwardian or Victorian, and probably Victorian. It was dated, it was given as a reward 1891, so about 20 years, about 15 to 18 years after this story was written. This is what very elegant gentlemen would wear and walk. They would walk with it. They didn't need a cane. It would be a walking stick. You'd go out and promenade, and you'd be in a long tunic coat. Maybe one day I'll wear my coat that I wore in our wedding, which was made in about 1903, which would go with this. So I'll do that one day, maybe a top hat. But in the meantime, this one's out of rosewood, and it has a gold tip. So the gold handle at the top is what it means by a gold stick. And this one was to F.W.J. Hearst from E.S. Jaffrey. The 17th of February, 13th of February, 1891. My birthday's on the 19th of February, so it's kind of fun. And this, I was able to get this from a very dear friend, Colby, who's Dutch, and she had it in her collection. This had belonged to the famous diplomat Averell Harriman, and it was from his collection. So then, everybody had walking sticks, and in the time when this was written, gentlemen would also have a very special walking stick like this. If I can open it. There we go. Look at this. It's a sword. So you had a walking stick and you could challenge people. There you go, you can see it. Challenge people to a duel. So sticks often had weapons, and later in the 19th century there was even a walking stick that had a gun, a pistol inside that you could pull and shoot. So I thought you'd like to see those, and then I'll show you some other clothing at the end, and we'll kind of do this week for the next 4 days. So we're starting with, oops, 1 second here we go. Chapter 2. The Little Prince and His Traveling Cloak. Everybody was very kind to the poor little prince. I think people generally are kind to motherless children, whether princes or peasants. He had a magnificent nursery and a regular suite of attendants, and was treated with the greatest respect and state. Nobody was allowed to talk to him in silly baby language, or dandle him, or dawdle him, or above all, to kiss him, though perhaps some people did it surreptitiously, for he was such a sweet baby that it was difficult to help it. It could not be said that the prince missed his mother. Children of his age cannot do that. Now that's wrong. We know that's not true. I'll talk about that at the end. But somehow after she died, everything seemed to go wrong with him. From a beautiful baby, he became sickly and pale, seeming to have almost ceased growing, especially in his legs, which had been so fat and strong, that after the day of his christening they withered and shrank. He no longer kicked them out, either in passion or play, and when, as he got to be nearly a year old, his nurse tried to make him stand upon them, he only tumbled down. This happens so many times that at last people began to talk about it. A prince and not be able to stand on his own legs? What a dreadful thing. What a misfortune for the country. Of course, they didn't think about him. Rather a misfortune to him also, poor little boy, but nobody seemed to think of that. And when after a while his health revived and an old bright look came back to his sweet little face, and his body grew larger and stronger, though still his legs remained the same, people continued to speak of him in whispers and with grave shakes of the head. Nothing worse than sympathy when people are not talking and whispering. I'm going to drink just a little bit. Feeling sorry for someone is not helping them necessarily. It's being kind of selfish. So, thank you for listening. We'll go on now. Everybody knew, though nobody said it, that was something, it was impossible to guess what, but it was not quite right with the poor little prince. Of course, people talked behind his back. Of course, nobody hinted this to the king, his father. It does not do well to tell great people anything unpleasant, and besides, His Majesty took very little notice of his son or other affairs beyond the necessary duties of his kingdom. People had said he would not miss the queen at all. She had been so long an invalid. But he did. After her death, he was never quite the same. He established him in her empty rooms. He established himself in her empty rooms, the only rooms in the palace where one could see the beautiful mountains, and was often observed looking at them as if he thought she had flown away thither, and that his longing could bring her back again. And by a curious coincidence which nobody dared inquire into, he desired that the prince might be called, not by any of the 24 grand names given him by his godfathers and godmothers, but by the identical name mentioned by the little old woman in gray, Dolor, after his mother Dolores. Now, the woman in gray needs to be explained. I had a friend who had an aunt, and there was a little old Quaker lady in my church when I was growing up. I grew up in the Quaker church, and she wore a plain dress. The lady in gray most likely was mauve, and she probably was a widow. And widows would wear gray after, it was a Victorian thing. They would wear gray after they'd lost their partner. My friend's aunt actually started a school for children of servants in Newport and through the Episcopal Church. And she always wore mauve kind of a mauve gray, kind of a purplish gray, because she mourned her husband who died very young. He died of the flu, actually, because he was out in the cold and going to the funeral of his brother. So that's why there were stages of dress for different mourning and for different things. It was a very structured society, something we don't have today. Usually when we go to funerals, people will often dress in black. That's a Victorian thing, but a lot of times people will dress in black but with some color just to cheer people up. So I thought you might like to know that. Let's go on. Once a week, according to established state custom, the prince, dressed in his very best, was brought to the king, his father, for half an hour. But his majesty was generally too ill and too melancholy to pay much heed to the child. Can you imagine? The prince would only be brought to his father for half an hour during the week, once a week. Only once, when he and the crown prince, who was exceedingly attentive to his royal brother, were sitting together with Prince Dolor playing in a corner of the room, dragging himself about with his arms rather than his legs, and sometimes trying feebly to crawl from one chair to another. It seemed to strike the father that all was not right with his son. "How old is his Royal Highness?" said suddenly to the nurse. 2 years, 3 months, and 5 days, please, Your Majesty. "It does not please me," said the king with a sigh. "He ought to be far more forward than he is now, ought he not, brother? You who have so many children, brother, his brother, you must know. Is there not something wrong about him?" "Oh no," said the crown prince, exchanging meaning looks with the nurse, who did not understand at all, but stood frightened and trembling with tears in her eyes. "Nothing to make your majesty at all uneasy. No doubt his Royal Highness will outgrow it in time." "Outgrow what?" "A slight delicacy in the spine, something inherited perhaps from his dear mother." "Ah, she was always delicate, but she was the sweetest woman that ever lived. Come here, my little son." And as the prince turned round upon his father a small, sweet, grave face, so like his mother's, his majesty the king smiled and held out his arms. But when the boy came to him, not running like a boy, but wriggling awkward along the floor, the royal countenance clouded over. "I ought to have been told of this. It's terrible, terrible," said the father. "And for a prince, too. Send for all the doctors in my kingdom immediately." They came, and each gave a different opinion and ordered a different mode of treatment. The only thing they agreed in was what had been pretty well known before, that the prince must have been hurt when he was an infant, let fall perhaps, so as to injure his spine and his lower limbs. Did anybody remember? Did nobody remember? No, nobody. Indignantly, all the nurses denied that such an accident had happened. It was possible to have happened until the faithful country nurse recollected that it really had happened on the day of the christening. The country nurse was the lady in gray, for which, unluckily, good memory all the others scolded her so severely that she had no peace of her life, and soon after, by the influence of young lady nurse who had carried the baby that fatal day, and who was a sort of connection to the crown prince, being his wife's second cousin once removed, the poor woman was pensioned off and sent to the beautiful mountains, from whence she came, with orders to remain there for the rest of her days. It's a cover-up. But of all this the king knew nothing, for indeed, after the first shock of finding out that his son could not walk, and seemed never likely to walk, he interfered very little concerning him. So basically, because he was crippled, he was ignored. We have a temptation to ignore people that have disabilities. That's why I'm hoping that all of you can reach out to someone, or your parents can reach out to someone who's locked in because of disabilities. The whole thing was too painful, and His Majesty never liked painful things. Sometimes he inquired after Prince Dolor, and they told him His Royal Highness was going on as well as could be expected, which really was the case. For after worrying the poor child and perplexing themselves with one remedy after another, the crown prince, not wishing to offend any of the differing doctors, had proposed leaving him to nature. And nature, the safest doctor of all, had come to his help and done her best. He could not walk, it is true. His limbs were mere useless appendages to his body. But the body itself was strong and sound, and his face was the same as ever, just his mother's face, one of the sweetest in the world. Even the king, indifferent as he was, sometimes looked at the little fellow with sad tenderness, and noticing how cleverly he learned to crawl and swing himself about his arms, so that in his awkward way he was active in motion as most children his age. Poor little man, he does his best, and he is not unhappy, not half so unhappy as I, brother, addressing the crown prince, who was more constant than ever in his attendance upon the sick monarch. If anything should befall me, I have appointed you as regent. In case of my death, you will take care of my poor little boy? Certainly, certainly, but do not let us imagine any such misfortune. I assure your majesty, everybody will assure you, that it is not in the least likely. He knew, however, and everybody knew, that it was likely, and soon after, it actually did happen. The king died as suddenly and quietly as the queen had done, indeed in the very room and bed, and Prince Dolor was left with either father or mother. Without father or mother, as sad a thing as could happen even to a prince. He was more than that now, though. He was a king. In no man's land, as in other countries, the people were struck with grief one day and revived the next. The king is dead, long live the king, was a cry that rang through the nation, and almost before his late majesty had been laid beside the queen in their splendid mausoleum, crowds came thronging from all parts of the royal palace, eager to see the new monarch. They did see him, the prince regent took care they should, sitting on the floor of the council chamber sucking his thumb, and when one of the gentlemen in waiting lifting him up and carried him, fancy carrying a king to the chair of state, and put the crown on his head. He shook it off again. It was so heavy and uncomfortable. Sliding down to the foot of the throne, he began playing with the golden lions that supported it, stroking their paws, and put his little tiny fingers into their eyes and laughing as if he had at last found something to amuse him. "There's a fine king for you," said the first lord in waiting, a friend of the prince regent's, the crown prince that used to be, who in the deepest mourning stood silently beside the throne of his young nephew. He was a handsome man, very grand and clever looking. What a king, who could never stand to receive his subjects, never walk in procession, who to the last day of his life will have to be carried about like a baby. Very unfortunate. Exceedingly unfortunate, repeated the second lord. It is always bad for a nation when its king is a child, but such a child, a permanent ripple, is not, if not worse. Let us hope not worse, said the first lord in a very hopeless tone, and looking toward the regent, who stood erect and pretending to hear nothing. I have heard that these sort of children with very large heads and great broad foreheads and staring eyes are, well, let us hope for the best and be prepared for the worst. Now that, children, is what we would call, I think what she's describing is Down syndrome. This is about, it's interesting because it was in the industrial age and there was some science. So they knew a lot about body shape and some diseases. So this is what she's describing here, is probably a Down syndrome child. She was hinting at it. In the meantime, I swear, said the crown prince, coming forward and kissing the hilt of his sword, I swear to perform my duties as regent, to take all care of His Royal Highness, His Majesty, I mean, with a grand bow to the little child who laughed innocently back again. I will do my humble best to govern the country. Still, if the country has the slightest objection. But the crown prince, being generalissimo and having the whole army at his beck and call, so that he could have begun a civil war in no time. The country had, of course, not the slightest objection. You wouldn't want a revolution, would you? So the king and queen slept together in peace, and Prince Dolar reigned over the land. That is, his uncle did. And everybody said what a fortunate thing it was for the poor little prince to have such a clever uncle to take care of him. All things went on as usual, and indeed, after the regent had brought his wife and her 7 sons and established them in the palace, rather better than usual, for they gave such splendid entertainments that made the capital so lively that trade revived, and the country was said to be more flourishing than it had been for a century. Whenever his regents and his sons appeared, they received with shouts, "Long live the crown prince! Long live the royal family!" Here's an illustration. There's a few colored illustrations. This is the little prince. And I'm not sure if this goes with the "Long live the prince." Looks like he's holding his ears. It may be. Can you see that? Let me show that to you. I'll show you some costumes that look very similar in a minute. Oh, here it is. Here is the little crown prince. I want to show you this, boys and girls. Here's the little crown prince. I'm going to turn on some lights. Just 1 second. Hey, that might be a little bit better. I'm still here. Hang on. Sorry, folks. I'm getting a new iPad cover. It fell. I'll be right back and we'll continue the story. Sorry for the interruption. Here we come. I think we're back. Punky's taken my seat. Punky sees a fly and she can't stand it. Come on, Punk. You can sit here, but I've got to sit down. Okay. All right. So, you need a walking stick, Punky? Can you see me okay? There we go. All right. Whoops. We're down a little bit too low. Hold on 1 second. Just those things that I've got there, I'll show you in just a minute. There we go. All right. Well, I showed you the pictures. Sorry about that. We're getting better every day, but not today. And in truth, they were very fine children. The whole 7 of them. That's the Prince Regent, or the Prince Regent's children, and made a great show when they rode out together on 7 beautiful horses, one height above the other down to the youngest, and on his tiny black pony, no bigger than a large dog. As for the other child, His Royal Highness Prince Dolar, for somehow people soon ceased to call him His Majesty, which seemed such a ridiculous title for a poor little fellow, a helpless cripple who, as you saw, was sitting at the bottom of the throne. With only head and trunk, with no legs to speak of, he was seen very seldom by anybody. Sometimes people daring enough to peer over the high wall of the palace garden noticed there, carried in a footman's arms, or drawn in a chair, or left to play on the grass, often with nobody to mind him, a pretty little boy with bright, intelligent face and large, melancholy eyes. No, not exactly melancholy, for they were his mother's. She was by no means sad-minded, but thoughtful and dreamy. They rather perplexed people, those childish eyes. They were so exceedingly innocent, yet so penetrating. If anybody did a wrong thing, told a lie, for instance, they would turn round with such a grave, silent surprise. The child never talked much, that every naughty person in the palace was afraid of Prince Dolar. He could not help it, and perhaps he did not even know it, being no better a child than many other children. But there was something about him which made bad people sorry, and grumbling people ashamed of themselves, and ill-natured people gentle and kind. I suppose because they were touched to see a poor little fellow who did not in the least know what had befallen him or what lay before him, living his baby life as happy as the day was long. Thus, whether or not he was good himself, the sight of him and his affliction made other people good, and above all made everybody love him, so much so that his uncle, the regent, began to feel a little uncomfortable. Oh, that's good, isn't it? Now I have nothing to say against uncles in general. They are usually very excellent people and very convenient to little boys and girls. Do you all have uncles? I bet you have some aunts and uncles. And some of your parents still have aunts and uncles, I hope so. I had wonderful aunts and uncles. I remember all of them. Even the cruel uncle of the Babes in the Wood, I believe, be quite an exceptional character. And this cruel uncle of whom I was telling was, I hope, an exception also. He did not mean to be cruel. If anybody had called him so, he would have resented it extremely. He would have said that what he did was done entirely for the good of the country. But he was a man who had always been accustomed to consider himself first and foremost, believing that whatever he wanted was sure to be right. Therefore, he ought to have it. So he tried to get it and got it too, as people like him very often do. Whether they enjoy it when they have it is another question. Therefore, he went one day to the council chamber, determined on making a speech, informing the ministers in the country at large that the young king was in failing health, so that it would be advisable to send him for a time to the beautiful mountains. Whether he really meant to do this, or whether it occurred to him afterward that there would be an easier way of attaining his great desire, the crown of no man's land, is a point which I cannot decide. But soon after, when he had obtained an order in council to send the king away, which was done in great state, with a guard of honor composed of 2 whole regiments of soldiers, the nation learned without much surprise that the poor little prince, nobody ever called him king now, had gone on a much longer journey than to the beautiful mountains. He had fallen ill on the road and died within a few hours. At least so declared the physician in attendance and the nurse who had been sent to take care of him. They brought his coffin back in great state and buried it in the mausoleum with his parents. So Prince Dolar was seen no more. The country went into deep mourning for him and then forgot him, and his uncle reigned in his stead. That illustrious personage accepted his crown with great decorum and wore it with great dignity to the last. But whether he enjoyed it or not, there is no evidence to show. Well, this is only the beginning of the book, so there's a lot more to come, and we'll find out maybe what happened to the little lame prince. It's a mystery, and you'll have to tune in tomorrow to find out. Now, and tomorrow we'll meet at 4, then we go back to 3, and we will do 5 days of this reading, then I'm going to take a break, and I have a butler's guide to Victorian household, and we're going to look at a few things that were used and done in those days. If any of you watched Downton Abbey, this is the perfect book for you to see. I'm going to actually do some things and read some of it for us the rest of the week, and then next Saturday we'll start on the next chapter. Now, so I'd like to show you some things. You kind of saw them when the camera fell, but this helps you children to see. This was actually, I think, this wasn't an adult's bonnet. It may have been my grandmother's, but it would have been, it'd be smaller if it were a christening bonnet. We had a christening bonnet it's too small for me, but anyway. There you go. And it would be tied around like this. This could have been a maid's bonnet in Victorian times. Probably was. Or a child's bonnet. Like that. So, I have some christening gowns. Both of our daughters were christened. And the first one was a gift from England from wonderful friends Eric and Wendy Weikart. And then for Abigail's christening, we had one, a real Victorian one with petticoat and everything. My aunt paid for it, and speaking of aunts and uncles, and bought this beautiful Victorian gown. I'm going to try to find them before the story's done. I can't find them. This is almost in tatters. This is really fine. It goes this way. Delicate cotton, more like a pima cotton, almost like a silk. And this is a christening gown. And all of the lace on here was hand done by my grandmother for my mother when she was young, and she was given a doll which was about this tall. The head was about like this, and this was a christening gown. A christening gown is longer than a nightgown. If the baby's being held here, it would drape over and it covers its feet. This has a petticoat that goes with it. I couldn't find it. But this is what a christening gown is. And christening is what in the early church called naming day, and it's when it's 40 days after the baby is born. The mother comes for purification, and the baby's name is given them. In the Jewish, it was the same in Jewish tradition that that babies' names, they waited because they wanted. I've mentioned this before. They waited to name the baby to see what its traits were. So they would wait 40 days and then see what its traits were, and then give them a name. But in this case, it was different. So that is a christening gown. Now, to show you boys and girls and adults who, I was privileged to have adoptive parents who were 47 when I was born, and they were both born in 1900. One of them, my mom was born in 1900, my dad was born in 1901, a few months later. And their parents grew up before the Little Lame Prince. I'm not sure of the exact dates, but most of them immigrated from Germany a generation before. A lot of them were farmers. My grandfather was a minister, and so was my great-grandfather, and they were German Methodists. And I actually talked to a man who was about 90 years old who wrote into an organization of a friend of mine, Ed and Diane Nippers, and he was in the German Methodist Church, and he talked about in the 20s all the German-speaking churches started switching to English or bilingual. He was still grieving that because the property then went over to another organization. And I wrote him, and it was in Missouri. I wrote him and actually found out he remembered my great-grandfather and my grandfather. My grandfather wanted to be a physician, and then he was called into the ministry. And he was really an amazing man. He's a beautiful writer. I have his journals. They're such tiny handwriting. I can hardly read them, but I can read them. And a lot of it's in German. Now that we are quarantined, I've been listening to Berlin Philharmonic in German, and some of my German is coming back because my adopted mother spoke German to me until I was 7. This is my dad, and this was his brother. His brother died when he was 18 from, I think, spinal meningitis. But this is like a sailor suit, and there was something called, and it has a belt, and then there's shorts, and then stockings. This is a christening gown, a short one. The babies, when they were young, it may not be though, because it's short. Babies, when they were young, when they were in diapers, would wear skirts like this, boys and girls, so that it would easily change the diaper, because all they had were cloth diapers. And then when you started getting older, then they wore silk stockings and this kind of jacket with a belt. And this was like a navy jacket. I think this is so cool. So my dad would have been, this would have been I'm not sure of the age. Probably 1909, somewhere in there. So that's how they dressed. It was very constrictive, and I just thought you might like to know. So when it talks about the baby feeling like he was being smothered with clothing and everything, what she's describing is even more than what I showed you. And if I can, I do have a traveling cloak. That was my father's when he was christened. It's out of white wool. It's just amazing. If I can find it, I will show it to you. And sorry about my hair. So we'll read chapter 3 next time, and maybe we'll find out what happened to the little prince. But as far as all the people knew, he was dead. Again, remember that, like the little lame prince, like they refer to someone with a big forehead and so forth. And phrenology was a big thing in the 19th century, the study of the brain and different parts of the brain. They thought that there were different ethers within the brain that affected personality. Phrenology is still around, actually. And then, as I said last night, think of someone who is lonely and has a disability. You know, now we have lots of help. Little lame prince would have had some kind of prosthetics or mechanical legs or something or other that he would be able to walk. I have a very dear friend years ago that had a baby that had birth defects and had really difficult times, and their life consisted of operation after operation after operation to correct it. And there were other conditions. He was born that way. It wasn't an accident. So there are people around you that may be suffering like this. And if you don't know of anyone, if you are a believing Christian or you believe in God, pray and ask God to show you someone who you can help. And as I showed you last night, there are fun ways to find toys, and maybe you boys and girls have toys at home that you can share with someone in need. So just ask your parents and make a plan and be creative. It's time for us all to be creative. I wanted to tell you one story. This story comes home to me because there was a story I heard just recently. I was in an orphanage and was not adopted until I was about 2. So the first year and a half, according to psychiatrists and to doctors, is the most important. In the book it said that children can't talk at all, communicate at all. Well, that's not true. From the moment they're born, the child is relating to his mother. When the child is born and the baby is put on, a newborn is put on her chest, there are things that are released physiologically in the baby in terms of comfort and hormones that continue. And if that's taken away, at a year and a half, if the child doesn't see the face of a mother or a familiar face, then they think it's disappeared. And that brings on severe trauma and abandonment issues, which I experienced and I'm still dealing with, even though I've had a full life and I've been loved by wonderful people. It's still part of my genetic, physiological memory. And the story I'll close with was, if you think this is like a sweet Victorian story, it's not. It's still happening today. I have a friend who has another friend who visited orphanages in Russia, which my daughter and my daughters both have gone to Russia, and we visited orphanages. We used to do lots of work with orphans in St. Petersburg, Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union. I told you about that. But this story haunts me because it brings back vague memories that I have. And that is, he would go to this one orphanage very often, and there was a whole room full of cribs with newborns. And he said the most haunting experience he ever had, and thing he will never forget, is to walk into a room with lots of cribs, 20 or 30 newborns, not making a noise, not one noise. The fact is they'd given up, and so there was no crying. They couldn't cry. They'd given up on life. And I know as an infant, for some reason I felt I had to protect myself, because the only human contact I had was with a bottle that was given me and my diapers changed. There was some touch, but it was not loving touch, and it was not for long, and it was not the same person. So tonight, hug all your children and your husbands and wives and everyone who you love, because life is fragile. Life is does not go on forever. There will never be normal life again, no matter how good everything comes after we get out of this crisis, because all of us have gone through this. And I was just talking today to someone who lived in New York, Manhattan, she was in high school during 9/11. She said that was in a specific place. This is so much different because it's kind of everywhere. And it's certainly not like World War II or the Depression, but for a lot of us, it's our first experience of both of those in a different form. We're much better off than any of our ancestors were. My three uncles, my wonderful four uncles, went to war. Three uncles, sorry, went to war. The fourth one died in infancy, a little bit like the little prince, only died from diphtheria. Somewhere I have his baby clothes. Anyway, they came back changed people, and I'm hoping that all of us will become changed through this experience. That we ask God to change us and to make us love others more. So thank you for sharing this wonderful story, and it will continue tomorrow, and I will keep showing you some artifacts. And tonight at 7, we will continue with the next chapter of The Horse and His Boy. It's been really wonderful being with you, and I look forward to seeing you tonight and tomorrow at 4, and then after that at 3 and 7. Have a good evening. Hug everyone you're close to, and if you can't hug them, do it at a distance. That's the hardest part of this, is not having real hugs. We all need human touch. So touch people's hearts if you can't touch their skin. Thank you, and have a good evening.